The first-class cabin of Flight 297 was filled with the quiet luxury of leather seats, sparkling champagne, and hushed conversations. But that calm was shattered in an instant. "My ring, it's gone!" Richard Harper's voice rang out, slicing through the serene atmosphere. The wealthy businessman shot up from his seat, his face flushed with panic as he clutched at his jacket pocket. "It was right here. A diamond worth millions, and now it's gone." The cabin froze, passengers exchanged startled glances, some whispered nervously, others simply stared. A ring worth millions. It was the kind of drama you'd expect in a movie, not on a routine flight. Emily Carter, the lead flight attendant, hurried over, her heels clicking sharply against the cabin floor. "Mr. Harper, please remain calm. We'll get to the bottom of this," she assured him. But her sharp gaze had already started sweeping across the cabin. And then it landed on her. Amara Winston, the only black passenger in first class, had been playing the role of Beth in recent years, insisting on handling all crew matters while her portion of the rest of the crew went on their way, settling into a deck chair. Amara had been quietly working on her tablet, oblivious to the chaos around her. But as Emily approached, her calm demeanor drew the attention of everyone in the cabin. "Excuse me, ma'am," Emily said, her tone polite but cold. "I'll need to inspect your bag." Amara blinked, momentarily caught off guard. She straightened her posture, her expression composed but firm. "And why, exactly, do you need to inspect my bag?" "It's just a precaution," Emily replied, her tone hardening. "We need to rule out all possibilities." The air in the cabin grew heavy, thick with tension. Amara's lips curved into a faint, incredulous smile. "I see, and I suppose I'm your first possibility, correct?" The cabin buzzed with murmurs. Some passengers nodded in quiet agreement with Emily, while others shot uneasy glances at one another. Amara's eyes didn't leave Emily's. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel, "but I won't be allowing that." The cabin went silent. What followed wasn't just a search for a missing diamond, but the unraveling of a story that would leave everyone on board stunned. Because the truth wasn't just about the missing ring. It was about power, prejudice, and a revelation that would turn this flight upside down. And, think you know who belongs in first class? Think again. What happens next will shock you. Before we dive deeper into this story, make sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Trust me, you won't want to miss the twists and turns that are about to unfold. The first-class cabin of Flight 287 was a picture of refined luxury. Rows of spacious leather seats stretched out in immaculate alignment, while a faint scent of fresh linens lingered in the air. The muted hum of the engines was a constant backdrop to the occasional clink of champagne glasses and hushed conversations. This was a sanctuary for the wealthy and elite, a world where discretion was prized and conflict were rare. Among the dozen or so passengers enjoying the comforts of this exclusive space was Amara Winston, an unassuming yet striking woman in her early 40s. Her presence was understated, though there was an undeniable air of authority about her. Dressed in a sleek navy blazer over a crisp white blouse, paired with elegant yet practical trousers, she looked every bit the professional. Amara had chosen this particular flight for its convenience. She was heading to New York to finalize a high-stakes merger, one that would solidify her status as one of the most influential women in the corporate world. But to the other passengers in the cabin, she was just another face. No one suspected that this composed woman was the CEO of a global financial empire managing billions in assets, or that she held a significant stake in the airline itself. Seated a few rows ahead was Richard Harper, a man whose presence was impossible to ignore. Tall and broad-shouldered, with slicked-back hair and a custom-tailored suit, Richard looked like the embodiment of wealth and privilege. He was the type who thrived in the spotlight, and he made sure everyone around him knew it. Richard's booming laughter frequently punctuated the calm of the cabin, drawing the attention of passengers and flight attendants alike. In his hand, he held a velvet box containing a 5-carat diamond ring, a symbol of his opulence and the centerpiece of his planned proposal to his fiancée, Lydia Beaumont, who sat beside him. Lydia, a statuesque blonde with impeccable style, was the picture of quiet elegance. While Richard dominated the room with his energy, Lydia remained composed, offering polite smiles and speaking only when spoken to. Attending to the passengers was Emily Carter, the lead flight attendant for first class. Emily had perfected the art of navigating the demands of high-profile travelers with grace and precision. Her blonde hair was neatly tied back, and her uniform was impeccably pressed. But beneath her professional exterior was a woman who prided herself on being able to read her passengers. From the moment Amara stepped onto the plane, Emily had noticed her. There was something about her presence that unsettled Emily. Not because Amara was demanding or loud, but because she didn't fit the mold of what Emily thought a first-class passenger should be. While Emily greeted Richard and Lydia with warm smiles and extra attention, her tone cooled significantly when addressing Amara. "Would you care for a drink, ma'am?" Emily had asked earlier, her voice polite but clipped. "Just water, thank you," Amara had replied with a faint smile. Emily nodded curtly and moved on, not bothering to make small talk as she had with the other passengers. The dynamics in the cabin were clear. Richard Harper was the king of first class, holding court with his booming voice and ostentatious displays of wealth. Lydia was his queen, quietly supportive, but clearly in his shadow. Emily was the gatekeeper, deciding who deserved the full benefits of first-class treatment. And Amara, to most of the cabin, she was invisible, a quiet enigma seated in the corner, keeping to herself. The flight began smoothly. Amara had settled into her seat, reviewing documents on her tablet, while Richard regaled Lydia with stories of his business conquests. Emily moved efficiently up and down the aisle, ensuring that everyone was comfortable. Amara tried to ignore the occasional glances she received from Emily. She was used to being underestimated, and she had long ago mastered the art of keeping her composure in the face of subtle bias. Richard, meanwhile, couldn't resist showing off the velvet box containing his prize diamond ring. He opened it with a flourish, holding it up for Lydia to admire. "Isn't it stunning?" he said loudly, ensuring that nearby passengers could hear. Lydia smiled softly. "It's beautiful." Richard laughed. "It better be. It cost more than my car." Emily, passing by at that moment, couldn't help but glance at the ring. Her eyes lingered for a second too long before she quickly looked away. "Careful with that," she said with a nervous laugh. "You wouldn't want it to go missing." Richard waved her off. "Don't worry, it's not going anywhere." But just minutes later, it was gone. It happened so quickly that no one could pinpoint exactly when. One moment, Richard was tucking the velvet box back into his jacket pocket. The next, he was frantically patting his pockets, his expression turning from confusion to panic. "My ring!" he exclaimed, standing abruptly. "It's gone!" Passengers turned to look at him, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. "What do you mean it's gone?" Lydia asked, her voice laced with worry. "I mean, it's not in my pocket anymore," Richard snapped. Emily hurried over, her clipboard in hand. "Mr. Harper, please calm down," she said, though her tone carried an edge of urgency. "When was the last time you saw it?" Just now, I put it back in my pocket after showing it to Lydia, Richard replied, his voice rising. Someone must have taken it. Emily's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly composed herself. Let me speak to the crew. We'll find it. As she turned to leave, her gaze fell on Amara, who was still seated, quietly observing the chaos. For a moment, Emily hesitated, and then her expression hardened. Excuse me, ma'am, she said, approaching Amara. May I have a word with you? Amara looked up, raising an eyebrow. Of course. What's this about? Emily clasped her hands tightly around her clipboard. We're trying to locate a missing item. Would you mind if we checked your bag? The air in the cabin grew thick with tension as Amara's expression shifted. Her calm demeanor didn't falter, but her tone carried a sharp edge as she replied, And why, exactly, would you need to check my bag? The first-class cabin buzzed with whispers as Emily Carter stood before Amara Winston's seat, clipboard in hand and authority radiating from her posture. Behind her, Richard Harper paced furiously, his earlier bravado now replaced with frantic anger. Let's be clear, Richard said, his voice rising above the murmurs. That ring didn't just vanish into thin air. Someone here must have taken it. Amara tilted her head slightly, her expression calm, but questioning. And you think I'm the someone, Mr. Harper? Richard pointed a finger toward her, his frustration spilling over. You were the only one who got up before it went missing. I'm not accusing. Oh, but you are, Amara interjected, her voice steady but carrying a shred edge. And without a shred of evidence, no less. Emily stepped in, attempting to regain control. Ma'am, we're simply trying to locate the missing item. If you would allow me to inspect your bag, we can clear this up quickly. Amara's gaze fixed on Emily, unwavering. Clear this up or confirm your assumptions, because I fail to see why my bag is suddenly of interest, while the belongings of others remain untouched. Emily's composure faltered slightly, but she straightened her back, her tone turning colder. You were the only passenger who left their seat during the time frame in question, ma'am. This is a matter of procedure. Procedure, Amara repeated, leaning back in her seat. How convenient that it applies only to me. Yeah, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers exchanged glances, their whispers growing louder. Some nodded in quiet agreement with Emily, while others looked visibly uncomfortable. She's being unreasonable, a man in a gray suit murmured to his companion. If she's innocent, why not just let them check? Another passenger, a middle-aged woman seated across the aisle, folded her arms tightly. Typical, she muttered under her breath. They wouldn't be doing this if she looked like the rest of them. A younger man seated further back stood up, drawing everyone's attention. This is ridiculous, he said firmly. You're singling her out without any proof. Why haven't you checked anyone else's belongings? Emily turned to the man, her expression hardening. Sir, I'll ask you to remain seated. We are handling the situation. No, the man replied, his voice unwavering. You're targeting her because it's easy, and everyone here knows it. Emily's face flushed, but she pressed on, determined to reassert her authority. Ma'am, she said, turning back to Amara, if you have nothing to hide, this shouldn't be an issue. Refusing to cooperate will only escalate the matter. Amara exhaled slowly, her composure never wavering. Mrs. Carter, that statement is as flawed as it is insulting. The burden of proof isn't on me to prove my innocence. It's on you to justify this baseless accusation. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. Even Richard seemed momentarily silenced by the sheer weight of Amara's resolve. But Emily wasn't done. If you refuse to cooperate, I will have no choice but to involve airport security upon landing, she said, her tone growing sharper. Amara raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a faint, humorless smile. Do what you must, Ms. Carter, but understand this. If you're wrong, and you are, you'll be explaining yourself to far more than airport security. The cabin was now divided. Some passengers continued to side with Emily, whispering about how Amara was making a scene. Others openly voiced their discomfort with the way the situation was being handled. A man in a tailored suit leaned toward his companion. This is getting out of hand. She's clearly overreacting. I don't know, his companion replied hesitantly. It feels wrong to single her out like this. Meanwhile, Richard's fiancée, Lydia, had grown increasingly uneasy. She tugged at Richard's sleeve. Maybe we should just wait until we land, she whispered. What if you dropped it somewhere else? Richard shook his head vehemently. I know I didn't, and I'm not letting this go. The cabin's growing unrest was interrupted by a new voice, a calm yet commanding presence that cut through the noise. Excuse me, the young man from earlier said, stepping forward. He was dressed modestly, but there was an undeniable air of confidence about him. Who are you? Emily asked sharply, clearly annoyed by the interruption. David Lewis, the man replied evenly. I work for Miss Winston. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Emily blinked, momentarily stunned. And let me make something clear, David continued, his voice firm. You are making a grave mistake. Not only are your actions unprofessional, but they are entirely unfounded. I would suggest you rethink your approach before this goes any further. Finally, Emily's composure cracked. She stared at David, then at Amara, the pieces of a larger picture beginning to form in her mind. Work for her? Richard said, his voice laced with skepticism. What is she? Your boss or something? David turned to Richard, his expression calm but pointed. She's much more than that, but I'll let her explain when she's ready. The tension in the first-class cabin of Flight 287 reached a boiling point as passengers continued to whisper and glance at Amara Winston, Emily Carter, and the increasingly agitated Richard Harper. The atmosphere was electric, heavy with unspoken judgments and growing unease. Emily, standing rigidly before Amara, seemed determined to reassert her authority despite the murmurs of dissent around her. Ma'am, she said, her voice louder now, refusing to cooperate only makes you look more suspicious. I strongly suggest you reconsider. Amara, her composure still unshaken, leaned back slightly in her seat, her calm gaze fixed on Emily. Suspicious to whom exactly? To you? Or to the passengers who've already decided that I don't belong here? Emily's face flushed, her professionalism slipping under the pressure of Amara's words. Let's not make this about something it's not, she snapped. This is about a missing item, not what? Amara interrupted, her voice cold. Not about bias? Not about the fact that you singled me out without evidence while ignoring everyone else in this cabin? Let's call it what it is, Ms. Carter. You didn't suspect me because of my actions. You suspected me because of my appearance. Emily's eyes darted around the cabin, searching for support, but many of the passengers avoided her gaze. The whispers grew louder, a few passengers even nodding in agreement with Amara's sharp observation. Richard, clearly fed up with the escalating situation, threw up his hands. This is ridiculous. If she's innocent, why not just let them check? Amara turned her attention to him, her expression firm but controlled. Because, Mr. Harper, this isn't just about your ring. It's about my dignity. and I refuse to let it be trampled on for your convenience." The cabin fell silent again, the weight of her words settling over everyone. The division among the passengers became more apparent. One elderly man in a tailored suit leaned toward his wife and whispered, "She's being dramatic. Just let them check the bag and be done with it." But across the aisle, a younger woman with short-cropped hair shook her head. "No, she's right," she said, her voice loud enough for those around her to hear. "This is profiling, plain and simple. It's disgusting." Meanwhile, another man near the back of the cabin, dressed in a smart blazer, leaned forward. "If they want to check bags," he called out, "they should start with Harper's. He's the one who misplaced it." Richard whirled around, his face reddening. "I didn't misplace anything. That ring is worth more than some people's homes. Someone here took it, and I have every right to demand it be found." The young man in the blazer wasn't backing down, and you're assuming she took it. Why, exactly? Because she got up to stretch her legs, or because she doesn't look like the rest of us? Richard opened his mouth to retort, but hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the implication. The argument was interrupted by David Lewis, Amara's assistant, who stepped forward again, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the chaos around him. "That's enough," David said firmly, his voice cutting through the noise. He looked directly at Emily. "You need to stop this, now." Emily stiffened. "Sir, this doesn't concern you." "It absolutely does," David interrupted, his voice calm but commanding. "I work for Ms. Winston, and let me warn you, you're treading on very dangerous ground." Emily blinked, her composure cracking further. "Work for her?" she repeated, her voice faltering. David nodded. "She's not just a passenger. She's someone you should have treated with respect from the moment she stepped onto this plane." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Passengers exchanged startled glances, their curiosity now fully piqued. "What's that supposed to mean?" Richard demanded, looking between David and Amara. David didn't answer immediately, but his expression was calm and unyielding. He glanced at Amara, who gave him a subtle nod, then turned back to Emily and Richard. "It means," he said evenly, "that if you knew who she was, you wouldn't have dared to treat her this way." Emily's face turned pale, but she tried to maintain her authority. "That doesn't change the fact that we're investigating a missing item," she said, though her voice was noticeably shakier now. "If she's innocent—" Amara stood, her movement slow and deliberate, commanding everyone's attention. "That's enough, Miss Carter," Amara said, her voice carrying a quiet power. "You've made your assumptions, you've embarrassed yourself, and you've insulted me, but you're about to realize just how wrong you are." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, the passengers sensing that something big was about to unfold. Before anyone could respond, a soft voice interrupted. "Excuse me," said Lydia, Richard's fiancée, her face pale. She tugged at Richard's sleeve, her tone hesitant. I think I might have seen something earlier." The entire cabin fell silent as everyone turned to look at her. "What are you talking about?" Richard asked, his voice sharp with impatience. "When you put your jacket in the overhead bin earlier," Lydia said, her voice trembling slightly. I thought I saw something fall out of your pocket." Richard's face froze. "That's impossible," he said, his voice wavering. "Is it?" Amara said, her tone laced with quiet intensity. "Because it sounds like the first place we should have checked is the last place you looked." The passengers watched in stunned silence as Emily gestured for another flight attendant to retrieve the jacket from the overhead bin. Richard remained rooted to the spot, his face a mixture of embarrassment and disbelief. As the young flight attendant retrieved the jacket and began searching its pockets, the atmosphere in the cabin grew heavy with anticipation. Would they find the ring? The air in the cabin was suffocatingly tense as the young flight attendant rummaged through Richard Harper's jacket, her hands visibly shaking. All eyes were on her, the collective anticipation of the passengers palpable. Even Richard, who moments earlier had been brimming with certainty, now stood frozen, his confidence unraveling with each passing second. A gasp echoed through the cabin as the attendant pulled a small velvet box from the pocket of Richard's jacket. "Is this what you're looking for, sir?" she asked, holding the box up for everyone to see. Richard's face turned a deep shade of red as he snatched the box from her hand. He fumbled it open, revealing the diamond ring inside, its brilliance catching the light. "It must have fallen in," Richard stammered, his voice suddenly meek. I didn't realize." "You didn't realize?" Amara Winston interrupted, her voice cutting through the cabin like a blade. She rose from her seat, her composed demeanor still intact, though her sharp gaze was locked on Richard. "So let me get this straight. You accused me, humiliated me, and allowed your assumptions to run wild, all because you couldn't keep track of your own property." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His fiancée Lydia crossed her arms, stepping back as though trying to distance herself from him. Was it that easy?" Lydia asked. He glanced around. "Richard," she said coldly, her voice dripping with disappointment. "You owe her an apology, right now, and with glares." Richard's head snapped toward her, his indignation flickering back to life. "I didn't mean, this isn't about, It's exactly about this," Lydia snapped, her usually soft demeanor replaced by visible frustration. "You jumped to conclusions without thinking, and now you've made a complete fool of yourself, and me." Emily Carter, meanwhile, stood frozen, her face drained of color. The revelation of the ring's location had shattered her thin veneer of professionalism, and the weight of her earlier actions now pressed down on her like an anvil. Amara turned her attention to Emily. "And you, Miss Carter," she said, her tone calm but cutting. "What do you have to say for yourself?" Emily stammered, her hands clutching her clipboard so tightly that her knuckles turned white. I was just trying to follow protocol, ma'am," she said weakly. "Protocol?" Amara repeated, her eyebrow arching. "Singling out a passenger without evidence? Publicly humiliating someone based on nothing but assumptions? That's your idea of protocol?" Emily opened her mouth but faltered, her words caught in her throat. The murmurs among the other passengers grew louder, a few voices clearly criticizing Emily's behavior. "Ms. Carter," Amara continued, stepping forward, "what you did today wasn't about protocol. It was about prejudice. And the worst part? You were so blinded by your assumptions that you ignored the most obvious possibility, the person who actually lost the ring." The first-class passengers, who had been quiet for most of the ordeal, now began speaking more openly. "I knew it was wrong to target her," a younger woman said, shaking her head. "This is why we can't just stand by when we see something unfair." Another passenger, the elderly man who had previously supported Emily, now looked visibly uncomfortable. I suppose I spoke too soon," he muttered, his wife glaring at him. The murmurs of agreement and apology rippled through the cabin, though none could undo the damage that had already been done. David Lewis, Amara's assistant, stepped forward again, his expression calm but firm. "Ms. Carter," he began, addressing Emily directly, "you clearly have no idea who you've been dealing with today, but let me enlighten you." The passengers leaned forward in anticipation, their curiosity piqued by David's confident tone. "Amara Winston," he said, gesturing toward her, "isn't just a first-class passenger. She's the CEO of Winston Financial Group, a company that manages over $500 billion in global assets. More importantly, she's a major shareholder in this airline. In fact," he added with a faint smile, "you could say she owns a part of it." Gasps filled the cabin. Emily's eyes widened in horror as the full weight of David's words hit her. Amara didn't say anything at first, letting the revelation sink in. Then, she turned to Emily, her voice measured and deliberate. "You want to de-escalate this? Fine, let's escalate it. But understand this, the only protocol that matters now is accountability." As the flight prepared to land, Emily's professional mask had completely crumbled. She avoided eye contact with Amara, Richard, and the other passengers, retreating to the galley in silence. Meanwhile, Amara resumed her seat, her calm composure unchanged. She pulled out her phone and sent a quick message, her fingers moving swiftly across the screen. Upon landing, 2 airline executives were already waiting at the gate, their expressions tense. As the passengers disembarked, one of them approached Emily. "Ms. Vikarta," he said firmly, "we need to speak with you immediately." Emily nodded wordlessly, following the executives with trembling hands clutching her clipboard. As Amara exited the plane, she was met by another executive who extended a hand nervously. "Mrs. Winston, on behalf of the airline, I want to personally apologize for what you experienced today. We will address this matter immediately." Amara shook his hand but didn't smile. "Good," she said, "because this isn't just about me. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen to anyone else." The passengers, now fully aware of Amara's true status, watched her leave in stunned silence. For Emily Carter and Richard Harper, the consequences were just beginning. As the passengers disembarked, the tension from the flight lingered in the air like an unspoken weight. Amara Winston stood near the boarding gate, speaking quietly with David while airline executives scrambled around them. Their hushed tones and nervous gestures made it clear they were desperate to contain the fallout. Meanwhile, Emily Carter sat in a small office near the terminal, awaiting her disciplinary meeting. Her once confident demeanor had crumbled entirely, and her trembling hands clutched a cup of lukewarm coffee. She replayed the events in her mind, each decision she had made, now glaringly wrong in hindsight. "I was pleased to see Manor accept the blame for bringing him to sanity. But the aftermath wasn't confined to her." Richard Harper, still clutching the velvet box, stood awkwardly near the baggage claim. His fiancée Lydia had walked several paces ahead, refusing to engage with him further. Passengers passed by, some shaking their heads in disapproval, others whispering as they glanced in his direction. Back in the terminal, the whispers among passengers grew louder. "I can't believe they put her through that," one young woman said, shaking her head. "And she's the one who practically owns the airline." "She handled it with so much class, though," another replied. "I don't think I'd have been that calm." An older man, who had initially sided with Emily during the flight, approached Amara with a sheepish expression. "Ms. Winston," he began, clearing his throat, "I owe you an apology. I spoke out of turn back there and I misjudged you. I'm deeply sorry." Amara regarded him for a moment before offering a small nod. "It's never too late to reflect and do better," she said simply, her tone neither forgiving nor harsh. As the crowd around Amara grew, one of the airline's senior executives approached her, visibly flustered. "Ms. Winston, we've prepared a private room where we can discuss this further. We want to ensure your concerns are addressed immediately." Amara raised a hand, silencing the executive. "There's no need for a private room," she said. "Transparency is key here. What I want to say, I'll say publicly." The executive's eyes widened, but he nodded reluctantly. Amara stepped forward, addressing the passengers who had gathered nearby. "What happened on this flight wasn't an isolated incident," she began, her voice clear and steady. "It was a symptom of a larger problem, a culture that allows bias and prejudice to dictate actions instead of fairness and respect. Today I was the target. Tomorrow it could be someone else." The passengers listened intently, their earlier whispers now replaced with silence. "I've seen this behavior before," Amara continued, her tone growing sharper. "It happens in boardrooms, in hiring decisions, and yes, even here, at 300, 0 feet. But I'm in a position to do something about it, and I will." She turned to the senior executive, her piercing gaze locking onto his. "This airline prides itself on world-class service, but today you failed to deliver that. If you truly value your passengers, you'll address these issues head-on, starting now." Inside the terminal office, Emily sat across from two airline executives, her posture stiff and her face pale. "M.S. Carter," one of them began, his tone professional but firm, "we've reviewed the incident on Flight 287. Your actions were not only inappropriate, but also in direct violation of our policies regarding passenger treatment." Emily opened her mouth to speak, but was interrupted. "You acted on assumptions rather than facts, and you allowed your bias to dictate your behavior," the executive continued. "This is unacceptable, and it reflects poorly on the values we stand for as a company." I didn't mean for it to escalate," Emily stammered. "I thought I was following protocol." The second executive cut her off. "Protocol is not an excuse for prejudice. Effective immediately, you are suspended from duty pending a full investigation. Further disciplinary action will be determined based on our findings." Emily nodded weakly, tears threatening to spill as she realized the full extent of her mistake. Meanwhile, back in the terminal, passengers began sharing their accounts of the flight online. Photos and videos captured key moments. Emmeline demanding Amara's bag, Amara's calm but pointed rebuttals, and the dramatic recovery of the missing ring from Richard's jacket. By the time Amara had left the airport, the story was already making headlines. Discrimination in first class, airline shareholder targeted on her own flight. Social media erupted with outrage, with users condemning the treatment Amara had endured. Many praised her for her poise and determination, calling her a role model for standing up against injustice. One tweet read, "Amara Winston just showed us all how to fight prejudice with dignity. The airline better make this right, and fast." Another chimed in, "Well, does it always take a public scandal for companies to address systemic bias? Props to Miss Winston for forcing the issue." Amid the fallout, Lydia Beaumont finally spoke her mind. Standing in the terminal, she addressed Richard in front of several lingering passengers. "You were so quick to point fingers," she said, her voice trembling with frustration. "You didn't stop to think, not even for a second, about the harm you were causing." Richard shifted uncomfortably. Lydia, I didn't, No, Richard," she interrupted. "You did, and I can't stand by someone who acts like that." With that, Lydia walked away, leaving Richard standing alone, the velvet box clutched uselessly in his hand. As Amara left the terminal, David walked beside her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You handled that perfectly," he said. Amara shook her head. "It's not about handling it perfectly," she replied. It's about making sure this never happens again. David handed her his phone, showing her a trending article about the incident. "You're already making waves. People are paying attention." Amara glanced at the screen and then handed the phone back. "Good. Now let's make sure those waves turn into something real." The aftermath of Flight 208-87 rippled far beyond the first-class cabin. As the story broke online, it quickly captured the attention of news outlets and social media platforms worldwide. Within hours, Amara Winston trended on Twitter, with thousands of users sharing their outrage over the incident and praising Amara's composure in the face of blatant prejudice. But for those directly involved, Amara, Emily, Richard, and the airline, the fallout was far more immediate and personal. In the days following the incident, Amara Winston convened her legal and public relations teams to address the situation head-on. She wasn't interested in revenge. She was focused on accountability and systemic change. "We have to make this bigger than me," Amara told her team during a virtual meeting. "This can't just be about one flight or one passenger. It's about creating an industry-wide shift in how people are treated, regardless of their background." Her team worked swiftly, drafting an open letter to the airline's board of directors and releasing a statement to the press. "The events of Flight 287 highlight the pervasive issue of bias in the travel industry," the statement read. "No passenger, regardless of their status or appearance, should ever feel targeted or humiliated. While I am fortunate to have the resources and platform to address this, many others do not. This is a call for transparency, accountability, and meaningful reform." The statement was accompanied by a commitment from Amara's foundation to partner with organizations that promote equity and diversity in the aviation sector. As the story gained traction, the airline issued its own statement, confirming that Emily Carter had been suspended, pending a full investigation. "While we are proud of our commitment to providing world-class service, the actions of one employee on Flight 207 fell far short of our standards," the statement read. "We deeply regret the distress caused to Ms. Winston and are taking immediate steps to ensure such incidents do not occur in the future." For Emily, the fallout was swift and brutal. News outlets published articles detailing her role in the incident, and social media users flooded her accounts with criticism. Sitting alone in her small apartment, Emily scrolled through the comments, her hands shaking. The weight of her actions and the consequences they had triggered pressed down on her like an unbearable weight. Meanwhile, Richard Harper faced his own reckoning. His fiancée Lydia had cut off all communication with him following the incident. She had moved out of his penthouse apartment, leaving behind a terse note that read, "I can't be with someone who acts without thinking and without compassion." Richard's business contacts, many of whom had seen the viral videos of his outburst, began distancing themselves as well. Invitations to exclusive events dried up, and his once sterling reputation within his industry began to tarnish. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he lamented to a friend over the phone. "You didn't mean for it to happen," his friend replied sharply, "but it did, and now you're paying for it." The god began to soar, sending his clothes and swords spinning away from him. Under mounting public pressure, the airline announced a series of sweeping reforms aimed at addressing bias and ensuring better treatment of passengers. Mandatory sensitivity training. All employees from flight attendants to executives would undergo intensive training on unconscious bias and customer service. Complaint review system. A new system was introduced to ensure passenger complaints were handled with greater transparency and fairness. Diversity and equity initiatives. The airline pledged to partner with Amara Winston's foundation to develop programs promoting diversity within its ranks. The airline CEO, visibly shaken by the backlash, also announced plans to meet personally with Amara to apologize and discuss further steps. In her private moments, Amara reflected on the incident. While she was proud of the changes her actions had sparked, the experience had left a lingering sense of frustration. Despite her position of power, she had still been subjected to the same biases faced by countless others every day. One evening, as she sat on her balcony overlooking the city skyline, David joined her with a glass of wine in hand. "You've handled this with more grace than most people would have," he said. Amara smiled faintly. "It's not about grace, David. It's about making sure the next person in my position doesn't have to go through the same thing." David nodded. "Well, if anyone can make that happen, it's you." Back in their homes, the passengers from Flight 287 couldn't shake the memories of what they had witnessed. For some, it was a wake-up call. The elderly man, who had initially sided with Emily, wrote a letter of apology to Amara, acknowledging his own complicity. "For too long, I've stayed silent in the face of prejudice," he wrote. "Watching you stand up for yourself that day showed me how much work I still have to do." Other passengers took to social media, sharing their accounts of the flight and pledging to call out bias whenever they saw it. The incident on Flight 287 sparked a broader conversation, not just within the airline, but across the travel industry. Other companies began implementing similar reforms, citing the event as a turning point. Amara's foundation received an outpouring of support, with donations flooding in to help fund its new initiatives. Within months, the foundation launched a global campaign advocating for equity in travel, ensuring that the lessons of Flight 287 would not be forgotten. The incident on Flight 287 became a defining moment, not just for Amara Winston, but for everyone involved. It was a stark reminder of how deeply ingrained biases could disrupt even the most routine situations, and how one person's strength and resolve could turn a catalyst for change. Months after the incident, Amara stood on a stage before a packed audience at a leadership conference. She was calm and composed as ever, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had fought and won a battle much larger than herself. "When I boarded that plane, I didn't expect to become a headline," she began, her tone thoughtful. "But what happened to me on Flight 287 wasn't unique. Every day people are judged, dismissed, or disrespected because of assumptions. Assumptions rooted in bias, ignorance, and sometimes outright prejudice." She paused, scanning the faces of her audience. "What made this moment different is that I had the privilege, the resources, and the platform to fight back. But many others don't. And that's what we must change. We need to create systems where fairness isn't a privilege, it's a given." The audience erupted into applause as Amara stepped back from the podium, her words resonating far beyond the room. The airline followed through on its promises, implementing widespread reforms that became a model for other companies. Under Amara's guidance, they launched mandatory training programs, revamped their complaint systems, and publicly committed to promoting equity at every level of their operations. The changes weren't just symbolic, they were real, measurable steps toward a more inclusive travel industry. Amara's foundation worked closely with the airline, ensuring that every employee, from gate agents to executives, understood the importance of treating every passenger with respect and dignity. For Amara, the incident was a turning point in her journey as a leader. While she continued to oversee her financial empire, she also dedicated more time to her foundation, using her voice to advocate for systemic change across industries. Her message was simple but powerful. We cannot change the past, but we can build a better future, one decision at a time. Passengers from Flight 287 also carried the lessons of that day with them. Some, like the elderly man who initially supported Emily's actions, became vocal advocates for fairness and accountability. Others used their platforms to share what they had learned, ensuring that the story of Flight 287 continued to inspire conversations about equity and justice. As this story comes to a close, we're left with an important question. What would you have done if you were on that plane? Would you have spoken up, or would you have stayed silent? Stories like Amara's remind us that it's not enough to recognize injustice. We must act against it, no matter how small or uncomfortable the moment may seem. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed a situation like this? How did you respond? If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video to support more impactful stories. Share it with your friends to spark meaningful conversations. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge, inspire, and empower. And most importantly, let us know in the comments, what does fairness mean to you? How can we all work toward a more equitable world?